So if I were to ask you, who's the largest debt holder in the United States? You'll probably guess Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Discover, one of those credit card companies, or all of them combined together. What if I were to tell you the largest debt holder in the United States is the US Department of Education? Probably surprise you, but it's true. So the next conversation, next topic of my video is basically on the US loan debt crisis, student loan debt crisis, and what it means for the future and why it's a national security threat. So stay tuned, I'll be right back. So here's the point. The United States Department of Education holds approximately $1.7 trillion, and these are the current statistics, $1.7 trillion in student loan debt, which out of 9% or so are in default. When you look at what happened during the COVID crisis, naturally that ratio will probably go up because many individuals and that weren't able to work. And yes, a lot of those student loans were deferred. As far as the federal government was concerned, they figured that, well, no one is able to go to school. So, or no one is able to work, so they actually deferred them for a little while. But not all of them, but some of them were deferred. Here's the problem with the student loan. Majority of the people that are going to school, right, and they occur 60, 80, say 100,000, say for a school teacher, someone who graduates with a graduate degree and comes out with about approximately $80,000 in debt. They haven't even begun their career yet, and they have this $80,000 mountain sitting on their head. Here's my question to the nation. When someone comes out in debt, when someone has typical amount of debt, right, say in life, and we look at their basis of operation in general day-to-day life, it is not very effective because you look at that person going to work with this mountain on their head, right? They not only have to maintain some sense of normalcy by having a family, having a mortgage, possibly a mortgage, other requirements that day-to-day requirements that usually most people have. As far as groceries, you're looking at clothing, what have you, for the family members themselves, and things of that sort. You're more or less looking at an individual not at full capacity, right? Because that's the way I would look at it. Someone is debt free, they basically are a lot more free in the way they operate in society. They have a lot less stress. They are able to maneuver a lot better. Therefore, that citizen is a lot more productive than the one that has debt. Now look at the ratio, the several million people that have student debt on them. And they're just about to start their lives, and they would like to have a family, kids perhaps, and move into the future by coping with this debt and surviving is extremely problematic, and it's extremely stressful to the nation as a whole. I could argue this thing many different ways, but if you in the beginning of the video I mentioned student loan debt crisis could also be a national security threat. And here's what I meant by that. When people have this excessive amount of debt on them and they're operating in society, they're not likely to be very involved as citizens in their civic duties. Therefore, they are not paying attention to who is being elected, what policies they are trying to pass, and what special interest is behind who. That's the least of their worries. Their main worry is to survive, to pay their bills, to take care of their family members, and simply just try to move along and see if they can reduce this debt. So, as a system, when you look at if you look at it philosophically, as a system, this is a pretty harsh system on the citizenry. This is not an easy thing for someone to sustain for a very long period of time. Therefore, I said this is a national security threat because if we're electing individuals that are basically for themselves and they're looking after their own needs as far as their own, uh, uh, you know, lives or their own power struggles or what have you, they're trying to gain power in society. They're able to do that because most people are not very concerned with who's doing what. And that's why we have the corruption, the excessive amount of corruption in politics currently. That leads to being uh, poor policies being passed. When I say poor, I mean policies that are not geared towards citizenry, they're more geared towards special interest. Therefore, it puts the nation in a national security threat. So if you're not electing the proper individuals, especially for national offices, they would not be able to understand what's happening around the globe, let alone their own nation, and what is in the best interest of their citizens, especially their own constituents, in their own districts, in their own states. So this is what I meant by that, by a national security threat. So that leads all the way into the political environment and then translates into policy. So that's how it becomes a national security threat. And if most people are uninvolved in electing the right policymakers, naturally we're gonna see the type of suffering that you're seeing right now. So here's what happens. We continue to balloon up the student loan debt into another trillion or so by the time another 20-year expires. We are looking at probably double the amount, so you're looking at probably $4 trillion in student loan. Is that sustainable as a nation, as a as a functioning society? I don't think that this is sustainable. Say even 10 years down the road, let alone 20 years. So in the short term, here's what we need to do. We need to do some researching of our own as individuals, as Americans, and figure out what is the best route for us to go. Do we really need to put our future citizens in debt, and the current, naturally the current that are paying for it, that already have debt on them? Do we need to change something here so we're able to have a prosperous future for our children and grandchildren, so on and so forth? So this is something we would need to look at as a nation, not as an individual. If you think as an individual, say, well, I paid off my student loan, I'm all fine, I'm doing great, so everyone else has to pay for it. I understand that, but look at those eras before that, before they had Medicare for our citizens, right? The pre-Medicare days, pre-Social Security days, life was different. So many individuals in their 60s and 70s had to either have no insurance or they had to buy very expensive insurance, which a lot of them couldn't afford in those days. We're talking about the Great Depression time, before FDR brought the Social Security, Medicare, and all that got instated during his time. So when you look at those, uh, the period before Medicare, the period before Social Security, the period, the all these stages before we had instated these social programs, yes, life was pretty difficult. Right after that, people start to see a change where our elderly didn't have to, uh, struggle with healthcare because they had Medicare and Social Security and all that. So every at every stage we have to make some sacrifices. So if we were to say, well, everyone has a student loan debt on them currently, many millions of Americans. Well, if you were to forgive, uh, uh, you know, part of these, what about those individuals that have already paid their student loans off? Wasn't that unfair to them? Absolutely, it would be somewhat unfair to them. But when you look at the period before Medicare and Social Security, you could say that it was unfair to those individuals that didn't have anything before and they were struggling with Medicare, Social Security. They had to fend for themselves and they still had to work till they were 80, 85 years old. And it was a very difficult period of time for them. They have to pay for medical bills on their own. They couldn't afford any sort of a health care. Um, so every generation has to decide what they need to do to not just better themselves, but take in account the struggles that we have right now and say, do we want these struggles for our future generations, for the out generations? And I would say, no, we wouldn't want struggle for the unborn, correct? Those American citizens who haven't even been born yet, I would say let's try to look after their situation, their needs now. That way, we would see our grandchildren, our great grandchildren, in a lot better situation than we face at this point. So, by being unselfish and saying that we may have incurred this debt, and yes, we need to find a way to either completely erase this debt because it could be done. Uh, Remember, the federal government is putting a lot of citizens in debt, and it is supposed to be the one taking care of these individuals, the individual citizens that are needing basic education. Now, most people wouldn't call a master's degree a basic education, right? They would say that's higher education. Totally understood. I point well taken. But when you look at undergraduate, that's a necessity. You would say providing that 4 years of college is not a very big deal because most places are requiring 4 years of college. So if you have a high school diploma, you're basically a worker at, at a Subway or a McDonald's or any of these, fast food places, restaurants, things of that, which is not a bad thing. But my point is that if someone is wanting to educate themselves, and you simply put them in a debt because they have this desire to better themselves and try to improve their lives by educating themselves. And mind you, an educated person is a lot more beneficial to the nation as a whole than someone who's choosing not to educate themselves. We didn't put the rockets on the moon. We didn't put man on the moon And we're not sending people to Mars now and other places without any sort of education. So if we're looking to be uh, a superpower for the next few hundred years, we're going to need to remove this debt, for one, and I mean erase this debt. Because when it really comes down to it, let's not kid ourselves, right? This is, we have a fiat system. We're printing money. We can continue to print money. It is really not backed by anything except manpower, correct? So here's what I say to the federal government. Since we are the federal government, we need to decide, the people need to decide, do we want this burden on our future generations, or should we make changes now? And if we decide we want to make changes now, we're going to need to start electing individuals who are sensitive to the fact that student loan is not sustainable. We should not even have student loan. When someone says, I have the will to educate myself and better myself, in turn bettering my state, my nation, and providing national security for my nation, I should be given that opportunity to do so. I should be able to educate myself to the highest levels possible because it eventually benefits the nation, hence providing a better national security. So once again, I argue education leads to a lot better national security. We may think we have national security right now, and we do. We're a pretty powerful nation, and I think we can sustain this for another few more years. But when you look at the mindset of the individual currently that has $100,000, $200,000 in debt, they become less and less involved in their civic duties. And since we are a nation built on we the people, okay, we the people meaning we are the government, we need to make sure that we take care of our own and make sure that a couple of things are taken care of. One, healthcare. Second is education. So anyone that thinks that this is an invalid argument, I would say prove it to me. I could prove this many different ways that this is an absolutely unnecessary burden on Americans and the future generations, especially the future generations. Because who are we kidding? These are all simple digits, and it's not like like we're our monetary system is not backed by gold. Our currency is not backed by gold. It's basically backed by manpower. And so when you look at that, you know, and you look at the amount of money that we spend, say, um, you know, on different wars that we've had in the last, say, few years, like if you take the Second Gulf War, spend um, over $1 trillion in the entire war on terror thing, right? The amount of money that we paid out to the war effort was tremendous. Not to mention, you know, blood and treasure, right? That cost the nation. So we had to send our youths, our citizens to go out there and fight for what? Let's look at that now, and then you understand what I'm getting at from a larger point of view. We are able to, and then this thing gets into a different area, you know, it gets into the corporate world, and then, you know, my criticism of why the corporations need to ease up on the on the citizens of United States now, and then our future generations, which will, of course, you know, is something that we need to constantly have bear in mind when we're talking about current situations. So look at the amount of money we spent in the Gulf War, right? Here's a war that happened post 9/11. Yes, everyone said, let's go and get, and I was for it too. Let's go and get Bin Laden, get him out of there, dead or alive, and we bring him back, possibly leave him rotting in Guantanamo Bay, and we, will be, happy that we, you know, didn't let 9/11 go in vain. So, and when you look at that situation, how the Bush administration went from going into Afghanistan looking for Bin Laden, and all of a sudden switched their direction to Saddam Hussein for no apparent reason, right? Supposedly he had nuclear weapons. He may have talked about nuclear weapons, and he may have postured himself as someone who was, um, uh, you know, wanting to possess nuclear weapons, was a national security to him, because he was constantly threatened by the Iranians and the mullahs in Iran trying to threaten his existence. So that was a regional security threat as far as that was concerned and Iraq was concerned. So we shifted our attention, the Bush administration, and I was supportive of their efforts till then. But then here's what my point is on all this. You'll see at the end what my point is. Um, Bush administration shifted their position to Iraq war, to Saddam Hussein, and overthrowing him and taking him out, because he was all of a sudden a national security threat to us. And he wasn't. He simply was crumbled by the sanction against him after the first Gulf War, and he was barely surviving. And he did not have that kind of a manpower to attack any neighbors after that, attack Saudi Arabia or anyone else, or Kuwait. He was already out of Kuwait. Yes, it was a disaster, that whole first Gulf War. But the second one was absolutely unnecessary, right? There was no reason for us to go in there except for one reason. This was basically you look at the beneficiary of that war, it was certainly not the American citizen, right? The American citizens still don't have health care. We still don't have basic education to our name, right? We can't even go through an undergraduate without being in debt. We don't have some other necessities. So who really benefited from that second Gulf War? It certainly wasn't the Americans. The American citizens didn't. And I'll tell you who benefited. It was two enterprises. When you look at who owns the oil of Iraq right now, right? It's certainly not American citizens, because we didn't end up with anything. We simply ended up in a worse shape than we went in there. We were added more debt to us, okay, that we have to pay. But look at the beneficiary. There are two current owners of the Iraqi oil, right? BP, Shell, the BP Royal Dutch company that's owned by basically the United Kingdom, London. So the headquarters of Iraqi oil company is in United Kingdom, London, right? And there are two owners there, listed. There's two listed owners. One of them is BP Shell, BP Dutch Shell oil company, which is basically owned by the UK government, and then the second is ExxonMobil. Okay, these are the two current owners of Iraqi oil. Now, when you look at that situation, I said, fine. We went in there because 9/11 happened, and we saw that someone attacked us on our nation, on our soil, and we wanted to avenge that. And 3,000 people were killed in the World Trade Center, and it was traumatizing to watch that. So all of us were for it, right? Now, when you fast forward and look at us right now, we still don't have anything except just debt. So who are the beneficiaries of the Iraqi invasion? I see as two beneficiaries there. the BP oil company and ExxonMobil. And what is ExxonMobil doing for us here? They hike up the prices even more at the pump. So we're even more screwed than we were when we went into Iraq. So not only they are taking the oil out of there with the blood and treasure used by American, taxpayers. Okay, we send our blood and treasure there. Okay, not to mention the billions that are missing all of a sudden. That God knows where they went. 9 billion or so is missing, right? No one knows where it just disappeared because it's just paper money, and it disappeared. Well, who's going to account for it? No one here is worried about it. No one on the media is talking about it. I don't see anyone talking about it and saying, well, we have $9 billion missing from the budget there, and no one knows where it went. Let's throw that point out of the picture for right now. Let's look at like I said, the two beneficiaries, ExxonMobil, BP, right? All right. So how is it that we end up in more debt, but these two corporations end up with tremendous amount of profits? Because as I understand it, Iraq has 10% of the oil reserves, right? Second to Saudi Arabia and Iran. So when you look at it, look at the beneficiary was not the American public. And this is my point. I'm not anti-corporation, okay? Most people will see this conversation as maybe he's leaning towards an anti-corporation's point of view. Absolutely wrong. I'm not anti-corporation. I am not even against the corporation's corporate greed. I am against the excessive corporation greed. I'm saying at some point we have to decide whether we are going to govern ourselves and say, be involved and say, look, we need health care for every single individual. Forget about this, I'm not paying for my neighbor's health care. Forget about this thing about I'm not paying for my neighbor's high school or higher education. We are a people that became a superpower by looking after our own. Okay, it was the GI Bills that educated after the Second World War. It was the GI Bills that educated the and brought the middle class into the picture. The middle class were not even known at that time. So the middle class was given birth by a thing called the GI Bill, right? We completely understand that. That gave rise to the middle class gave rise to the society that we have. And middle class, by the way, is an unnatural thing in society. If you look at it from a philosophical point of view, that's another subject. But as is, the way we stand right now, going back to my earlier point, we were not the beneficiary of the last Gulf War, the war before that, or any other war for that matter, right? And we support all of them because it comes down to national security. So excessive corporate greed is what I'm referring to. That's given birth to this situation of student loan debt crisis. Because who ends up loaning the government? It's the corporations. They will go to the corporations or we go to China to get money. If we need money to spend on this and that, we don't have that money. So I understand that the corporations have to show profit and they are a necessary beast, okay, that the nation needs to survive, because we can't eliminate corporations and say, okay, we're going to go the other way. That's not sustainable either. We need corporations who built this nation. Remember, it was the old robber barons that built our highways and bridges and gave us electric and did all these things that we currently enjoy. So, not anti-corporation anyway. I am, however, against an excessive corporate greed. That is what I say that we need to put a stop to. So, sooner or later, the corporation is going to have to realize we're going to have to ease up on the Americans when it comes to at least a couple of items there. One, healthcare, second education. And when I say education, I mean this is a birthright. This is not something that you know is basically sustainable as doing without. So um, if we imagine if we are a nation that didn't promote any education at all, not even high school, we barely even promoted fifth grade education, where would we be now? I don't think it would be a superpower in any way, by any means, no matter what kind of money we brought from where. It didn't matter. 10 nations were supplying us with all sorts of revenue and all sorts of gold. We would not be able to sustain that. So, going back to my earlier point about I am not against any corporations by any means. However, I am against their excessive greed. Okay, and we will need to look at it, discuss this thing, discuss this thing amongst ourselves as Americans. We need to stop this infighting of Republican, Democrat, and you're this and you're that. The other side is always the evil side. I'm frankly very tired of it. Many Americans are very tired of that. That's why they're not even involved in politics anymore. I left the Democratic Party, became an independent. I'm a progressive. Left the independent, became an independent simply because I didn't like the way the Democrats were doing their business. I didn't feel like they were looking out for the average public, because the average public needs my type of thinking there, the way I see it. We got to provide for our people. We got to be able to give them health care. We got to be able to give them basic education. I am going to leave it at this uh, point that, with this point that excessive greed of the corporations is what um, giving birth to these situations, whether it's the student loan debt crisis or the healthcare situation. Um, by no means against corporations. I just need to make that point clear. And then in the future videos, I'm going to talk a little bit more on this, depending on, as there's a demand for it. Naturally, I feel like I need to talk about it that way. I'm going to bring it up as much as I can, but I'll leave it at that. So have a awesome day. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.